Last Saturday, the 2nd of December, was the bicentenary of what we now know as Birkbeck University of London, but which was founded in 1823 as the London Mechanics Institution. Our speaker this evening, Joanna Bourke, is Professor Emerita of History at Birkbeck, and she has quite a long history of researching quite problematic, what we might call problematical subjects these days, issues like fear and that kind of thing, and has written 15 books on various subjects in the field of medical and military history. And most recently, though I think she may have something even more recently than this, is her book on the history of Birkbeck College. So who more appropriate to speak to us this evening than Joanna? So I will hand over to her to you now.
Thanks, look, I'm really, really pleased to be here, and thanks for the introduction. I mean, as you probably already heard, I work on really very, I'm told to stay in front of the camera.
No, you're fine.
I work on a range of really very different topics, but a lot of my work has actually been on the history of different kinds of violence. So I think people in this room can kind of imagine my sort of bemusement when I was asked to write the history of Birkbeck, the institution. There's not much killing happening in my institution. There's not much mutilation. There's, I know. But really, what surprised me was just how much I fell into that kind of history, which is why I wrote Our History of Birkbeck, 200 Years of Radical Learning for Working People. And, people here in this room know a lot about this kind of history. So I'm really looking forward to engaging with you about it. When Birkbeck was established, it was established in 1823. So as you just heard, as Ruth just mentioned, we've just had our 200th anniversary, which is fantastic. But when it was established, it was called the London Mechanics Institution, and it was founded, and this is not working. Can I get some help here?
It often happens. It just freezes at the start because it hasn't been used for a minute.
Oh, good, thank you.
The screen.
But it was established in thank you. Let's try. Oh, there we go.
It should be working.
It was established in the Crown and Anchor Tavern in London, where 2,000 people turned up to set up the institution. There was a call for, if you're interested in educating working mechanics, working men and women, turn up. 2,000 men and women turned up. And this Crown and Anchor Tavern is a very distinguished place. It's not like, I get very annoyed when people say we were established in a pub. The Crown and Anchor Tavern is a very distinguished place here. You can see it here on the side here, the Crown and Anchor there. And it was one of, wasn't the first, but it was one of the first mechanics institutes in the world. And like all of them, it was sort of animated by this idea that working people should be given the opportunity to expand intellectual horizons. The Mechanics Institutes also believed in what they called at the time the importance of useful knowledge and the role of education, not only as kind of fulfilling people's intellectual needs and desires, but also, of course, their moral and spiritual desires as well. And the 1820s, and the period of incredible growth in the number and the popularity of mechanics institutes throughout the world. Although classes, of course, for the education of working people has a much longer history. We have some 18th century experts here in the room. They had actually been founded sporadically since the 18th century. Most notable is Joseph Middleton's Spitalfields Mathematical Society, which taught scientific subjects to artisans and to craftsmen since 1717. But I think it is still nevertheless fair to say that the systematic establishment of these mechanics institutes is often credited to, and rightly credited, to the physician and philanthropist George Birkbeck. And this sort of foundation myth of all of this is that in 1799, George Birkbeck there, physician, he had been invited to teach what was then called natural philosophy and chemistry at the Addisonian Institution, which had been founded 3 years earlier under the will of John Anderson, former professor of natural philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And the founding myth is that George Birkbeck needed a particular instrument for one of his classes. And so he visited firstly he was struck by the workmen's, the mechanics, real basic ignorance of engineering facts and knowledge. But the second thing he was really struck by was their great hunger for knowledge. So what he did is he promptly opened up his classes at the Andersonian Institute to mechanics on Saturday evening, so evening classes here. And I have to have a little pause here just to say that when we're talking about mechanics in this context, now obviously these early students were literally mechanics, but actually in this period of history, mechanics was a much broader term to the one we use today. It really means working, people who work with their hands. And George Birkbeck's aim, was to ensure that, in his words, that working men would cease to be a mere machine toiling on from day to day, but would understand the laws on which his operations were based and therefore perfect himself in his calling. And what was very interesting for George Birkbeck and also for the movement that developed was demand for this kind of education was extremely high. So by the fourth class, for example, there were 500 mechanics in attendance in his classes. Well, George Birkbeck himself left Glasgow in 1804 for London, and he set up this really fashionable medical practice. In addition to this fashionable medical practice, he also served as physician to the General Dispensary for the Relief of Poor in Aldersgate Street, which provided home visiting and outpatient treatment for paupers and for working class men and women in that area of London. George Birkbeck was also active in lots of medical societies, chemical societies, meteorological societies, the London Institution, which was established in 1809 for the diffusion of science, literature, and the arts. But it was during this stage of his life that George Birkbeck forged these very, very important friendships with some of the people that we now know are some of the most important people of the period, radicals and economists of the period: Ricardo Hume, John Hume, William Corbett, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, John Stuart Mills, and it goes on and on and on. So he also was forging at this time these strong professional but also personal friendships with these really important people. So within this milieu, George Birkbeck was well placed to throw his energy into a wide variety of social causes, including the Reform Act of 1832, which transformed the electoral system, the fight to repeal the duty on paper and the tax on newspapers. This is actually really important because it was the tax on paper and the tax on newspapers that meant that ordinary people couldn't afford to buy these things. So it was severely limiting the ability of people to contribute to political debates and to the dissemination of knowledge. Okay, so in 1823, the patent agent Joseph Clinton Robertson and the economist Thomas Hodgkin, both of the Mechanics magazine, and these are two really important people we can talk about if you like later, along with the so-called radical tailor of carrying out this call for the establishment of the London Mechanics Institution. And George Birkbeck, who was not part of this call to establish the institution, quickly, though, got involved. And he was considered to be the kind of ideal president for such an organization because of his respectability, because of his contacts, and because he was generally respected amongst people from different political backgrounds. So this was the start, according to this foundational myth, it's more complicated than that, of course, of what was to be an international movement. So we don't have great stats, to be honest, for this. In fact, I think these statistics are severe underestimates, but anyway, the best statistics that we have, or the only statistics that we have, suggest that by the middle of the 19th century, there are 610 mechanics institutions in England, 55 in Scotland, 25 in Ireland, 12 in Wales. Institutes were also flourishing in the US, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and I've already said that, and elsewhere. And these institutes claimed to address the educative needs of mechanics. And as I said earlier, this term is used much more broadly than we use it today, although most mechanics institutes were established with the support of local dignitaries and philanthropists. The majority of members, they weren't called students, they were called members, called themselves operatives or members of the working class. So these men are not the laboring poor. They, in fact, some of them employed people. They were employers. And within a lot of these institutions, especially the London Mechanics, debates about who should wield power within the institutes. One article published in 1826 was entitled "To the Members and Managers of the Mechanics Institutions in Britain and Ireland." And this anonymous, and I've tried to find out this author, if anyone you know better than I do, I'm really grateful. Anonymous author insisted that the operative classes for whose exclusive benefit all mechanics institutions profess to be instituted must retain control. The author admitted that, quote, "the employers of the operative classes, as well as others of the benevolent rich, have in many places come forward with their money, books, and instruments to aid in the establishment of your institutions. Such is one of the best modes of promoting mutual kindness between the rich and the productive, the productive classes. But let not this class of person expect power in return for their gifts. By so doing, they would have made sordid bargains instead of gifts, and would nullify all those claims to benevolence and sympathy which would be otherwise their natural and sufficient reward." Okay, so this tension between getting gifts from more wealthy people and retaining control by the operatives. However, what we see as the century progressed is that the proportion of members who worked with their hands, and that's a term, often you had to sign a ledger to say whether you worked with your hands or not. But anyway, we do see that the proportion of those who are saying that they worked with their hands declined. So what we're seeing is that the classes attended by members and membership themselves was increasingly popular in London. I'm talking about here. We can talk about regional differences later. The members were increasingly clerks, shopkeepers, and teachers, for example. And this shift in membership caused huge political and internal debate and controversy, but it also led to a broadening of the curriculum within these institutions. So what you see is that technical and scientific subjects remained important, but throughout, and I've done an analysis, by the way, of the London Mechanics Institution's library catalogue for 1887. Anyway, we can talk about that if you want. So technical and scientific subjects are still there and still remain, but more literary, more historical, more art, what we would call arts-based classes started to grow in popularity, and numbers of books in these libraries increasing hugely. As statesman, orator, and poet, George Howard, the 7th Earl of Carlisle, equipped in 1858, while mechanical engineering and other scientific entered with classes in music, dancing, drawing, modeling, French, and even millinery. It's no doubt an important pursuit in its way. There's laughter in the room, but obviously considered lesser than these older forms of more scientific and mechanical things. Howard's banter and the laughter that followed his comments about these more arty type stuff was in fact a reflection of, I think, the unease that was still being expressed in the 1850s about, firstly, the broadening of the class base of mechanic institutions, but more importantly, in my view, the educational needs of female members of these institutes, both in Britain and throughout the world. And it's this importance of women in the mechanics movement that was a real source of anxiety within institutions. On the one hand, there was questions like, well, would the presence of women in the institutes lead to immorality? In other words, the sort of notion of unchaperoned women mingling with men in the same halls. Would it, I know, dear, would it enhance competition for books and lecture space? What if women took out all the books from the library? Would the scientific nature of the lectures be diluted, since it was feared that women might demand more leisure-orientated classes such as art and music? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, would educating women, working women, enhance their employment opportunities? For example, they did music classes, they did art classes. This was disparaged by the male leadership of the institutes, but these classes were not actually leisure orientated. These classes were being used by women to become teachers of art or music, private teachers, and etc. Would these classes, would admitting women promote greater equality between the sexes, more fulfilling relationships? As early as 1826, prominent Owenite William Thompson pleaded with mechanics institutions nationwide to let your libraries, your models, and your lectures be equally open to both sexes. Equal justice demands it. Long have the rich excluded the poorer classes from knowledge. Will the poorer classes now exercise the same odious power to gratify the same antisocial propensity, the love of domination over the physically weak half of their race, in other words, women. It's beautiful lines, I think. It was a point echoed by radical politician Roland Detreux in 1831. He had actually founded the new Mechanics Institution, which was a breakaway from the Manchester Mechanics Institute. And he believed that the education of women had to be at the heart, at the center of working class emancipation. He argued that it was necessary to raise the females of the working classes from the state of degradation, in order to make them rational companions of men. By providing working class women with education, their menfolk would be encouraged to turn away from immorality and crime. Educated women, he argued, and many others argued this, would raise rational children. Their domestic labor would enhance families, communities, and the entire nation. In his words, individual reform of women will secure national happiness. So women at the heart of this vision of an improved Britain. Now, for liberal as well as radical educationalists, the lodestone was this thing I mentioned already, useful knowledge. No one promoted this theme more effectively than Henry Brougham, and he's one of the main promoters of the London Mechanics Institution. Now, Brougham was a lawyer by profession, but he came to public notice because of his role as chief advisor to Queen Caroline, the estranged wife of King George IV. By the 1830s, Brougham was Lord Chancellor of Great Britain, where he was an active supporter of the 1832 Reform Act and as an active abolitionist, the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act. And he's a central person for the London Mechanics Institution. In 1826, that's 3 years after the establishment of Birkbeck, London Mechanics Institution, he founded the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. Crucially, his book on education, though, was this massive success. Entitled, here it is, Practical Observations upon the Education of the People, addressed to the working classes and their employers, 1825. This became, if you like, the Bible for mechanics institutions everywhere, and it sold, just for the time, amazing number of copies. The first year alone, Practical Observations went through 19 editions. According to one admirer, not since the scriptures were first published and circulated in the common tongue has there been such an important text. So what does this book tell us, or why was it so influential? Now, in it, he made a real strong argument for the need for working people to be educated. And this is a radical proposition for the time. He contended that only tyrants and other bad rulers should be terrified by the progress of knowledge among the mass of mankind. He maintained that the time is past and long gone where bigots could persuade mankind that the lights of philosophy were dangerous to religion. He argued that the peace of the country and the stability of the government could not be more effectually secured than by the universal diffusion of knowledge about the true principles and mutual relations of population and wages. So his 1825 book was a milestone, in large part because the Mechanics Institutes were faced with, no surprise here, exceptionally high levels of hostility. Opponents had four main concerns. First was that educating working people would be detrimental to good morals. By the way, This is an illustration. One of my favorite books in the catalogue for 1887 is a book that is called The Delirious Effect of Strong Liquor on the Population. And the author, the only name for the author that we know, is the author was a water drinker. Anyway, this is the fun. This is from the book. I love that image. Anyway, okay, that educating working people detrimental to good morals. John Dunlop, a Scottish Justice of Peace, maintained that, quote, a literary and scientific education would not generate that change of heart required in scripture, nor would it advance morality to a sublime and scriptural pitch. And he was particularly worried, no surprise here, about how education would be really bad for the morality of female members. Scottish essayist and priest Archibald Allison expressed similar sentiments in more vivid terms. In 1838, he argued that educating working people would give them the means of the gratification of the animal or the sensual propensity. He also advocated for the censorship of books made available to working people. He contended that education that was unaccompanied by any adequate restriction upon the books workers read or any adequate religious instruction was a very great cause of the depravity of the time. Allison agreed or education is power, but according to Allison, not according to Bacon, it could be the power to do mischief as much as good, or even more than good. In his book, The Social Condition and Education of the People of England and Europe, Joseph Case summarized this position when he observed that a spirit omnipotent for evil, a spirit of revolution, irreverence, irreligion, recklessness, and more dangerous of them all, a spirit of unchecked, unguided, and licentious intelligence is abroad, which will be the most dangerous enemy with which Christianity has hitherto had to cope. Second and related, that these are all overlapping concerns, but a second related concern expressed by opponents to the religious monopoly over education. Churchmen and their supporters feared that any education that was primarily scientific and philosophical rather than moral and religious was risky. That was a quote from conservative Anglican biblical scholar Edward William Grinfield, 1824-5. Grinfield believed that it would be far better that the common people of this country should remain totally illiterate than they should thus be furnished with tools by which they would inevitably work out their own and public ruin. Like Allison, Grinfield wanted to know who was going to be responsible for choosing what books working men and women would be reading in these mechanics institutes. He believed that it was desirable that the choice of such books should be left to those whose superior knowledge may enable them to direct the reading of others. It was folly to educate people beyond which they needed to know, especially when such knowledge would not make a working man more happy in that station to which Providence had called him. Grinfield urged the upper classes of society to do everything in your power to give the laboring orders a religious, virtuous, and useful education by founding this education on the love and fear of God, and by associating it with a strong attachment to the existing institutions of our country. So in other words, this use of useful knowledge is very different from the useful knowledge of people like Rome and the people who established the London Mechanics Institution. For Grinfield, useful meant exactly the opposite of what the founders meant. It meant ensuring the maintenance of social hierarchies. He addressed working people directly, advising them to remember that knowledge is valuable only as it is connected with an advancement of piety and religion, that sobriety and contentment are far more valuable qualifications than any attainments in mere art or science, and that those who would confine your education exclusively to the purposes of the present life are no real friends to your happiness and your welfare. Now, these theologicals, number one and number two, are basically theological moral objections, but actually they were supplemented by much more practical objections. The third and fourth anxieties related to the establishment of mechanics institutions is that they would ferment social and political disorder. And some commentators, in fact, it was quite common commentators to draw a link between education and crime. Higher amount of education, the higher amount of crime. And in the words of John Dublot, Scottish Justice of the Peace, speaking before the 1834 Select Committee on Drunkenness. Oh, I'd love a glass of wine. Anyway, according to him, well, when you talk about intellectual things, it's just where you want to go. According to him, a comparatively better education was coexistent with a greater amount of crime. If evidence was needed for this claim, and he got together all these statistics, purported statistics to prove this, he urged the commissioners, look at France. Makes sense to me. Archibald Allison, a Scottish essayist, made a similar argument in front of the Select Committee on Combinations of Workmen, that is, trade unions. He claimed that his statistical analysis of 83 departments in France revealed that the amount of crime is just in proportion to the quality of intelligence that prevails. That crime is invariably the greatest in those departments where there is the most knowledge and education, and invariably the least in the reverse. Now, the possibility that educating working people would incite social disorder paled alongside fears that it would incite political disorder, political chaos. Of all the arguments against the Mechanics Institutes, this was the loudest one. For Moses Angel, who was active in the Jews Free School, the Mechanics Institutes were an improvement on the tavern, the billiard room, the cheap theatre, and the casino, because they at least attempted to encourage the cultivation of the mind. However, they also risked turning half-educated men into ill-formed politicians, and therefore generally, as he put it, revolutionist, or at the very least, Democrats. For Angel, democracy was as dangerous to social stability as all-right, all-out revolution. This is also what the Orthodox chief rabbi of the empire, Nathan Marcus Adler, argued, although he framed it more broadly by musing that members of the institutes were turning into dreamers, talkers, and vague reasoners. Dangerous thing. One critic even contended that educating working men was as perilous as educating animals, and this is my favorite, by the way. Suppose, this anonymous author in the Edinburgh Review wrote 1826, suppose that some friend to humanity were to attempt to improve the condition of the beasts of the field, to teach the horse his power and the cow her value, Wouldn't that make the animal less trackable and useful, and not so profuse of her treasures, he means milk, not so profuse of her treasures to a helpless child? Once again, useful knowledge here was equated with knowledge that maintains the social the status quo, rather than questioning it. It was linked to anxieties about weakening deference of the lower orders to their superiors. In the words of an author writing in 1825 in the St. James Chronicle, every step which they take in setting up the labourers as a separate and independent class was a step towards destruction. A scheme, he continued, a scheme more completely adapted for the destruction of the empire could not have been invented by the author of evil itself, that is the devil. The Reverend George Wright, in Mischiefs Exposed, 1826, expressed this view even more succinctly, warning that the institutes were guaranteed to degenerate into Jacobin clubs and become nurseries of disaffection. So, and this is, by the way, from the Crown and Anchor Tavern. This barrage of hostility towards mechanics institutes and other educational organizations catering to working people failed, though, to dent the momentum of reform. After all, the institutes were part of a much larger movement within politics at this time. The early 19th century was a time of intense political and economic reform. Civil society itself was undergoing revolutionary change. Industrialization was transforming relationships between different classes. Even the most conservative employer was beginning to recognize the need for a slightly is the word here, slightly more literate and educated workers if their businesses were to flourish. This was especially the case in the large industrial centers where the economy was dependent increasingly on skills of workmen. Economic competition, especially from continental Europe, was a concern. Was the UK falling behind? Governments were tackling elementary education, especially after the Education Act of 1870, providing compulsory education and progressively raising the age at which children were required to attend school. So in other words, increasingly there was this argument that actually instructions given at mechanics institutes could be a useful supplement to this broader movement. And of course, working people themselves were really, really keen. This was largely because mechanics institutes were very much local initiatives. Indeed, I think it's kind of a bit problematic when I talk about the rapid spread of mechanics institutions in the UK and around the world as if it was part of a movement. I mean, it is partly that, but actually it's much, much, much more ad hoc than that makes out. Mechanics institutes were established by local communities. They represented local interests. The institutes in Australia and Ireland are just a couple of examples of diversity in the establishment of these. I mean, colonists to Australia quickly adapted what they knew about mechanics institutes in Britain to the Australian context. Australian institutes were often based in, unlike in Britain, they were often based in underdeveloped rural areas, such as Van Diemen's Land, which in 1827 established the first Mechanics Institute in Australia. So really importantly, these institutes not only are local, but they are much, much, much more than educational institutes or establishments. Their buildings served as libraries, reading rooms, meeting spaces, galleries, theatres, venues for sports, fairs, weddings, baptisms, funerals. Similarly, Irish communities, they began establishing mechanics institutes from 1824. But again, the context in which they were established was very different to that of England or Manchester or London. Unlike in Australia, like in Australia, Irish institutes were located in provincial, agricultural, primarily agricultural towns. And they played, and this is important, they played really important roles in cutting across sectarian divides, providing relatively neutral spaces where Catholics and Protestants could mingle socially. And of course, many Irish institutes were inspired by temperance politics. That was really at the heart of it. Okay, these differences are important because what I think is that they actually represent, I love this sign, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. They represent alternative visions of the purposes of mechanics institutes. So in other words, there's alternative visions of what these are meant to do. Were they vehicles for improving social morality? Or were they key to promoting an entrepreneurial ideals? Was the spread of the institutes due to enthusiasm by working people themselves to kind of better themselves? Or were they more political? That is, hotbeds for the promotion of universal suffrage, factory reform, even revolution. This diversity in aims has stimulated a lively debate about the value of mechanics institutes. Even vigorous champions of education for working people had major concerns. Famously, in The Condition of the Working Class in England, 1844, Engels, co-founder of Marxism, reproached mechanics institutes for being organs for the dissemination of the sciences useful to the bourgeoisie. He accused their teachings of being tame, flabby, subservient to the ruling politics and religion. Taking this a step further, Engels even denounced these institutions for propagating a constant sermon upon quiet obedience, passivity, and resignation to fate. In contrast, Engels believed that working people should be educated in proletarian reading rooms, run by the workers themselves, rather than sponsored by wealthy philanthropists, such as Birkbeck, George Birkbeck, and Brougham. Now, this critique has been taken up by many historians, and there is a lot to say for it. But it's really interesting that, at least in the context of the London Mechanics Institution, which had a rule that you were not to debate questions of politics or religion, that in fact they did all the time. So the London Mechanics Institution invited radicals constantly to come and speak to them, as did mechanics institutions elsewhere. Leeds, Manchester, who were really big in promoting Chartist and Owenite ideals. Cheltenham, writings of Bentham, Owen, Cobbett were in the library. Sutherland welcomed Chartist leaders. Institutes that began with one motive. So in other words, they may have begun with the idea of improving the morals of working people, but they often developed into something much more emancipatory and socially diverse as the century continued. Many of the institutes provided their members with vital organizational and administrative skills, which encouraged, in turn, these members to participate in political movements and radical causes. Indeed, it gave them skills to actually do so effectively. As economic historian Joan Lorett argues, working people used education to transform agencies designed for social control into instruments for emancipation. They were major propellers for the labor movement, socialism, cooperation, social reform, enfranchisement, and women's rights. Now, as I've argued throughout this talk here, the definition of useful knowledge was, in fact, a highly contested one. As we've seen, deeply embedded ideas about class difference, including fundamental differences in ideas about innate superiority and inferiority of the different social orders meant not only that working people were viewed as incapable of imbibing knowledge, but that when they did so, it could only actually lead to societal chaos. The founders of the various mechanics institutes, as much as their opponents, had differing views of what was useful. Their members, or students, also sought education for a variety of motives, including social advancement, political ambition, leisure. When addressing members of the Manchester Mechanics Institute, George Howard insisted that the Institute's aim was to develop, quote, the intellectual, the mental, and the higher qualities of our nature. What that meant was precisely what was decided by the working people themselves, the members. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Joanna, for that really great insight into the way how these institutions such as Birkbeck came into being. Have we any questions from the floor, first of all? Henry.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I'm bound to wonder how many of the other institutions that you pointed out all around the world ever turned into great universities like Birkbeck. What happened to them all?
I'd better repeat the question for the benefit of people who are joining us via Zoom. How many institutions you wanting to know?
Well, what happened to all the other institutions?
What happened to similar institutions worldwide that were set up in similar ways, I think is what Henry is wanting to find out about.
Did they turn into great universities?
Did they turn into great universities?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is very broad. It depends, which is not a very helpful answer. I mean, there was a huge decline in mechanics institutions with the rise of compulsory education. Fundamentally, a lot of the institutes did turn into universities. Birkbeck is certainly not unusual in that. In fact, a large, in fact, I would have said a majority did turn eventually into institutions of higher education, formal institutions of higher education, co-opted into government systems of education. A lot simply vanished, disappeared. They may revive for a period and then vanish again. Again, these are local initiatives. So you need local supporters to keep it alive, as with a historical society. But what's one of the things that's really interesting is the longevity of many of these institutes or institutions, particularly in places like Australia and Ireland, where they are serving really important social needs. They're not fun, they've become less about education as such and more about community halls, community places where people meet, do things together. Sometimes that's educational things. Historical societies are really very popular in this, but also sometimes it's art and crafts, sometimes it's simply political, local politics, those sorts of things. I mean, if you go buildings throughout London, you see mechanics institutes everywhere if you're looking for them, even more so in Australia. So if you go into the outback of Australia, I mean, I'm not exaggerating, every town, every village, you can find a mechanics institute. And some of them, a good proportion of them, are still operating. But again, they're serving local needs here. So it's declined because of compulsory education, but they do turn into, many turn into universities.
No, did I see a gentleman with your hand up there? Somebody? No? Yes, right. Catherine, have we got people who would like to ask questions?
We have some questions online. Mike Marriott would like to know, is modern Birkbeck still having to fight some of the same challenges? And if not, what has changed?
Should I repeat the question? Is Birkbeck fighting the same sorts of challenges, or have things changed?
Well, Birkbeck, we 4 days ago we celebrated our 200th anniversary, bicentenary. Birkbeck is part of, it's one of the distinguished universities in the UK. It's in the top 150, sorry, in the world. We are fighting the usual challenges that are faced by higher education elsewhere. I mean, we don't have the challenges that I spoke about today about whether it was even right and proper to educate people are not ones that we are facing today. But we do face, all institutions, university institutions, face different challenges about the marketization, for example, of education, the idea that students are all the same. And so, you know, that given choice, students will make, or people will make the right choice, and just ignoring economic differences, ignoring socioeconomic, ignoring racialization, and ignoring a huge range of differences. So we face all of that. One of the things I find really interesting in terms of Birkbeck today is the need increasingly to emphasize how important it is for adults to be given opportunities for part-time education. So previous governments, for example, the most obvious example is the ELQ rule that was introduced a decade or so ago. The ELQ rule, this sounds really boring, but it's fascinating. The ELQ rule means that anyway, if you have a degree, the government will not support you if you do another degree at a lower level. Okay? Now, in a economy where there's dramatic change in the needs and the skills, people need to be constantly not only upskilling, in other words, doing a certificate and then doing a BA and then doing an MA, they also need to be reskilling. And what the ELQ rule did was it meant that you didn't get any support for that. And that is devastating for individuals who want simply to learn more about a particular subject. It's also silly in terms of the economy, where, you know, people, the time has gone, long gone, where people did a degree, went into a job, 50 years later retired and got a gold watch. That's gone. You know, people are now reskilling, taking different jobs, moving jobs, and that is going to be part of our work. One of the interesting things that happened very, very recently is both Conservative and Labour governments are eradicating the ELQ rule. They agree that it's been very detrimental. So in other words, the short answer is we don't face the same problems, but yes, there are different issues that come up, particularly with an institution that is dedicated to part-time mature students and people who may not have had the opportunities when they were 16 or 18 or whatever.
Have we any more, Catherine?
Yes. Alan Walker would like to know, how did the institutions relate to the polytechnics?
Yes. How did these institutions relate to the polytechnics? Do you mean the former, what used to be polytechnics in this country that have subsequently become universities in the last 30 years? Is that correct? Is that what you're meaning? As opposed to maybe in France, because you have something like the Polytechnique, don't you? I suspect it's the polytechnics in this country that's the...
Yeah, I mean, yes. So, I mean, this relates to my answer to an earlier question. So many of the London Mechanics Institutes became what we now call polytechnics. And then, of course, more recently converted into universities. And that there's a long history of that, particularly with regards to Manchester, Liverpool, but lots and lots of other places. That is their history.
Have we any more, Catherine? And how many people? We don't know. No, it doesn't. Okay. Oh, yes, gentleman with the green jacket.
In your history of the mechanics institutions, you emphasize very strongly the kind of local context as well as the national context, but local context, and it's locally grounded and locally funded. Did they have any relationship either by taking over some of the buildings or actually exchange relationships with an earlier educational initiative, namely the dissenting academies in the 18th century particularly, which also were very locally grounded, although there was a national context. And many of them survived way into the 19th century. And if they didn't survive, their buildings did.
Right, we're talking about local institutions.
It's all about dissenting academies.
Oh, dissenting academies. And their relationship to their local areas.
Whether mechanics institutions had a relationship with dissenting academies, which in the 19th century were declining but still existed.
Yes, that's a really good question. So the question is about relationship between the mechanics institution and this longer tradition of dissenting academies, but also there are other similar sorts of traditions that existed before. And I guess my answer to that is I'm not 100% sure. I can only speak for the London Mechanics Institution, which I know that's the one I know really well. And the answer there is no. There were, of course, in the same area of the London Mechanics Institution, these dissenting academies and other groups. But actually, to my knowledge, they did not engage with them. But the reason I'm hesitating, I don't want to make a generalization about elsewhere in Britain, because I simply don't know. My gut response is I haven't seen in the secondary literature any discussion about that. So, but that's, and certainly it's not the case with the London Mechanics Institution. I mean, then the question becomes, of course, why or why not? And some of these are in opposition. They see themselves in opposition. They're quite often, you know, I'm emphasizing the locality, the local nature of them, but within those local communities, there are strong class, religious, and other divisions that keep, you know, this is where dissenters go, and this is where others go. Those sorts of questions, and certainly the London Mechanics Institution itself was resolutely tried to distance itself from what they saw as the more religiously inspired or groups. Now, they didn't succeed in doing that, but they certainly tried to do that. I mean, London Mechanics Institution is it's established by a lot of Quakers and a lot of radical left socialists and Whigs. So they did see themselves as very, very different. But it would be really interesting, and I actually will look this up, about other institutes in the UK, about whether they had more of a link. And particularly interesting here, I think, would be Belfast and Wales. So Wales would be the obvious one.
Continuing on from that, UCL was criticised for being a godless institution. Was Birkbeck ever criticised on those grounds?
Yeah, Birkbeck was criticised for being godless, not in the same way, because UCL, this was a fundamental tenet, if you like, of UCL's existence, which it wasn't in the context of the London Mechanics Institute. But certainly they were regarded as, because they didn't centre religion, they never used the Bible even as a literary text, which is very, very unusual. Now, there were attempts, and this comes back to the point of social control. There were attempts, though, to make the London Mechanics Institution, or to encourage it in a more religiously orientated way. And this comes back to, you know, analysis I did of the catalogue in 1887. Catalogue is fantastically interesting. Didn't think I'd become such a nerd. Because you look through and you see, well, what were they? What books were in the library? which gives some indication. We know what they're teaching, but what books are in the library? And they're really interesting things, for example, about phrenology, about premature burial, about things dear to your heart, Ruth, about a lot of things it's very clear that women were reading. So very, very high proportion of female readers, female authors, sorry, and things like that. But the reason I'm mentioning this is there is a section in the catalogue called theology. So books on theology. I was looking at this, and there's quite a number of books on theology in our library. But this is the catalogue for 1887. Most of the books that I was looking at in the catalogue were books that were published in late 1860s to the 80s, 1880s. So in other words, you know, that period, heavily dominated. When you look at the theology section, and only in the theology section, suddenly you get older books. They're published in the 1820s, 1830s and 1840s. So anyway, what this tells me is that these books were donated to the London Mechanics Institution when it was established, and then they stopped being donated because they didn't keep up the theology books. They're old books. And that's interesting. So clearly, well, it's not clearly, I mean, an assumption one can make is that in those early years, the books are being donated, books are expensive. There's still the tax on paper and tax on books and everything. They're being donated by richer people who want to push theology books on the members. And then at some stage in the 1860s, either the people giving books simply gave up, or there simply wasn't any demand for it anymore, and it just stops. There's none. There's very few books under theology. So that's an interesting thing. So the point I'm making here, just one final comment here. The point I'm making here is that sometimes a nerdish attention to the details of catalogues can actually suggest really quite interesting things. It also suggests quite a lot of really quite radical books scientific books were in the library, which suggests something.
Catherine, we got someone else?
One comment from Chris Foster. He says, fabulous presentation. Being a retired and former working bloke in London, it was just up my street. Which I think segues nicely into thanking the
Yes, well,
speaker.
thank you very much, Joanna, for a wonderful talk. And yes, I'm a nerd too, because that has been my line of work most of my life, my working life, cataloguing. So yes. Thank you very much.
Woman of my heart.
Thank you very much, Joanna.